All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to unpack an ancient fable, but it's really about a very modern psychological trap, one that shows how fear can, well, turn us into our own worst enemies.
This right here, this sentence gets to the chilling truth of what we're talking about. I mean, think about it. It's saying that under just the right kind of pressure, something completely innocent about you could suddenly feel like a huge liability, maybe even a crime.
So how on earth does that happen, right? How can fear twist how we see ourselves that badly? Well, believe it or not, an ancient fable gives us the perfect blueprint.
Okay, so our story begins with a tyrant's decree. This is a lesser-known fable from Aesop, and it all kicks off in the kingdom of a powerful and, well, a deeply flawed ruler.
And it all starts pretty simply. You've got the lion, the king of his domain, right? He's in the middle of a meal, a goat to be exact, and bam! He gets scratched by the goat's horns. It's really just a minor injury, but for him, it's a huge blow to his pride.
So the lion's reaction, it's not just about the pain. Oh no, it is pure narcissistic rage. It's like, how dare this thing I chose to eat be so brazen as to fight back? In his mind, the problem isn't what he's doing, it's the horns. The horns themselves are the problem.
And so, because of this tiny personal offense, he issues this absolute, completely irrational command. This isn't a law based on justice or reason. Nope. It's based entirely on his own wounded ego. And the effect? It is immediate. A wave of terror just washes over the land. Every single animal with horns, whether they did anything or not, starts fleeing for their lives. The decree itself is terrifying, sure, but it's the sheer irrationality of it all that really poisons the air. And that brings us to our main character, the hare. Now, we all know hares don't have horns. He's completely exempt from this law. He's got nothing to fear from the decree itself. He should be perfectly safe, right? So let's look at the anatomy of fear, because the hare's dilemma is exactly where the story goes from being just a simple tale to a really profound lesson in psychology. We need to break down what's happening here. Okay, to really get this, we have to look at what these characters symbolize. First, you've got the lion. He's the irrational tyrant, the source of all this random, arbitrary power. Then there's the goat, who's really just an accidental instrument, the poor thing that triggered the tyrant's rage. And finally, the hare. He's the terrified subject. And honestly, he could be any one of us, living in the shadow of that kind of power. And this right here, this is the core of what we're talking about today. We're calling it the hare and the shadow dynamic. It's what happens when the fear of an irrational power makes an innocent person look at their own harmless features and see a crime. And that is exactly what the hare does. He catches a glimpse of the shadow of his own long ears, and in his terror, he confuses them for horns. He's literally projecting the lion's madness onto himself.
So you see, the hare's real enemy isn't the lion. It's his own fearful anticipation. He knows the tyrant is completely illogical, so he's thinking, it doesn't matter what I say. He'll just twist the facts and say my ears are horns. So in the end, he's not undone by a crime he actually committed, but one he's terrified he might be accused of. Okay, this is an old story for sure, but this shadow in your life dynamic, it plays out all the time in some really practical, everyday situations. You've probably seen it or maybe even felt it yourself.
Yeah, this dynamic shows up everywhere. Let's think about it personally. You have an employee who quits over some vague new company policy because they're afraid their unique way of working, their long ears, if you will, is going to be misinterpreted as a problem. Or, interpersonally, someone with past trauma might push a new partner away because they see the shadow of betrayal in a totally innocent comment. And professionally, a small business owner might just shut down because of a confusing new regulation, not because they've broken it, but because they're terrified of a potential violation.
These are the exact pitfalls we fall into. These are the traps. When we act like the hare, we end up fleeing from a shadow, not a real threat. We let some tyrant's potential irrationality become our reality. And what's really crazy is that in the end, we're doing the tyrant's work for them by punishing ourselves.
So if that's the trap, what's the way out? How do we stop running from our own shadows and, face the sunlight?
It really comes down to a clear choice. We can live in the shadow, driven by fear, projection, and this guilt we put on ourselves, or we can choose the sunlight. We can ground ourselves in reality, trust in our own innocence, and just stand firm. It's a great little detail in the story.
The hare only saw his shadow because his back was turned to the sun.
So how do we actually make that choice? Well, we can start with some mental tools, some growth mantras. These are active ways to reframe our thinking. Things like telling yourself, I act based on reality, not on fearful anticipation. Or, I refuse to let my innocent features be interpreted as crimes. How about, I distinguish between a shadow and a real threat? And maybe the most important one, I trust my known innocence over my projected guilt. Every single one of these is a conscious choice to put truth ahead of fear.
And that really brings us to the final and I think most powerful takeaway from all this. The hare's real tragedy wasn't the lion's crazy decree. It was that he allowed the lion's madness to become the lens through which he saw himself. So the question this whole story leaves us with is, when the sun comes up, are you going to see your own features for what they really are, or are you going to let a shadow chase you right out of your own home?